Hi, I'm Tim Vandervan and I'm sitting here today with my brother Josh. We're going to be talking about densifiers, and hopefully by the end of this conversation you're going to be able to tell which one of us is the most dense guy in this room.
Well, I think that's pretty easy to answer, Tim, but because we're brothers, we're also going to stay away from the your mama jokes, right? Tim, welcome to the Works Plus TechTalk Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about the hard stuff. Talking about densifiers in particular. A lot of questions that we often get asked, so we're going to have a bit more of an expanded conversation about it.
Sounds like a fluid conversation.
It starts out as a fluid conversation, but it becomes a solid talk. All right, I'm going to come straight out of the box here and say, how do we know when we have reached a point of saturation, and why do we even ask the question in the first place?
Well, how about we just talk about the term to start with? Because that is a term that's bandied around. We talk about it at seminars, and we know that a lot of guys are using this term these days. It hasn't always been around. What is the point of saturation? What does it refer to?
Okay. Is there a difference between point of saturation and point of rejection?
Ooh, that's a good question. I'm going to stick with probably point of saturation from a terminology point of view.
All right, cool. All right,
I get a lot of rejection in a whole lot of other places, but when it comes to concrete, this is my only way of point of saturation.
Okay, so it sounds to me that we had to change it to point of saturation so you wouldn't be triggered in the conversation.
I got it. So rejected.
I got it. All right, so let's paint the picture here then. Contractor is on site. We've ground the floor back, exposed aggregate. We've grounded it all, and now it's come time to densify the concrete in order to harden the matrix and make it more similar to the aggregate. Okay, so we're creating uniformity in the surface there before we're going into what's commonly called a transition stage, where we start the honing process. This is where we are at. We're about to put the densifier down. Tell us how you would recommend installing densifier at this point in time and why.
I'm going to start with the why first. I think it's probably the easier one to answer. And essentially, and we touch on this in our training, the densifier is there to do a number of different things in the polishing process, to assist the polishing process as far as an outcome or end result is concerned, but also to enhance or improve the actual material working with. So from a functionality and durability point of view, so it's not just an aesthetic thing, it's also there for some genuine properties that improve the actual piece of material working with. So the reason we're doing this now is multiple, but
Tim, this is the first question. We've got 7 or 8 here.
There's just a lot of things going through my mind. So we the why for it is because we want to improve the concrete. So obviously we're talking about using a silicate, often referred to as densifiers, and there's different types of silicates out there in the marketplace, as we know, with different mix ratios, different concentrations, different bases, different carrier molecules, all that sort of stuff. But essentially what we're trying to do is get the silicate component. So, whether we're talking about a sodium silicate, a lithium silicate, a potassium silicate, a colloidal silicate, it's the silicate component that we're after here. And we need to get the silicate into the concrete to actually react with the byproduct of the hydration of the cement in concrete, which is basically when the cement is wetted in a concrete mix, when it's all wet and being mixed, that it reacts with the water and creates that calcium hydroxide, and it's the silicate in the densifier that reacts with that hydroxide, which is called the free lime, commonly referred to as free lime in the concrete. So We know there's free lime in the concrete. We don't know how much is in the concrete. We'll probably talk about that shortly. But we want this silicate to get in there and react and combine essentially with the hydroxide and the calcium hydroxide, because that's going to form a solid material and give us that crystalline, glassy type structure in the concrete.
So then, would I be right in explaining it like this, that if the densifier is a part A in a two-component system, we're taking densifier, the silicate, we're adding it to the floor, and inside the floor is where the catalyst resides, the part B. When we put the two together, we get a reaction and then it hardens. Is that an easier way to understand it?
Yes, I think it is. I'm just thinking through from a chemical reaction point of view whether that stands to reason in the different scenarios that we could be talking about this. But yeah, let's just talk about it being a part A and a part B for this point.
Yep. Okay. So then the part B is always in the concrete and we're bringing the part A to it. That's where we're at now. Now, then if we're talking about point of saturation, I think it starts to make a bit more sense how much part A we need to bring to the part B. Where do we actually want the product to sit once it's reacted and hardened? So then I'll ask my question again. How do we know when we've reached a point of saturation?
Well, the question is we don't really.
No.
We don't absolutely know we've reached a point of saturation. So
because we can't mix this like a typical part A and part B.
That's right. We're not mixing it out externally and then adding to it. We're actually hunting out our part B essentially within the concrete. So without actually being able to take samples of the concrete, core samples and those sorts of things, and testing how well we've actually saturated or combined our silicate or our part A with the part B, the hydroxide in the concrete, we don't actually know. But we can do things that give us a fairly good indication that we've done the best possible job of doing that.
Name some of those things.
Well, we just put lots and lots of material into the concrete. Look, really, I guess it's probably just a physical. It's a physical display that we've topped up the concrete essentially as much as we can. When we get to a point of rejection, not saturation. When we get to that point where we're actually getting, let's call it excess material that's now forming and building up on the surface of the concrete or over the surface of the concrete, we can be, to a degree, we can be fairly confident that we have made our best effort to essentially introduce those two ingredients to each other as best as possible.
Sure, okay. And why is that important? Why is it important to get that much densifier, not just into the concrete, but to essentially end up on top of the concrete? Why is that important?
Well, I would say unless you're getting a build-up on the surface, you don't actually know that you've got enough in. So step one is it's sort of confirmation that you've done the best you can as far as getting that silicate into the concrete. The reason you want to really react as much as possible or get as much in is because the more of that reaction that you can encourage between the free lime and the silicate in the concrete, the more of this this crystalline material that comes as a result of that reaction you're building up in the concrete. So you're creating more solid in the concrete, which is going to make your concrete more dense, but it's also going to make it more polishable, and it's going to make it, from an aesthetic point of view, more attractive at the end, particularly if you're doing a glossy, if you're looking for a glossy, shiny, reflective result with high definition and clarity. The better job you do of creating that densified crystalline structure in the concrete, the better your end result will be. Of course, the other result that you get from doing this is there's only so much Part B to react with in the concrete, right? We talked about that before. We're pumping that concrete full of Part A essentially to react with as much Part B as possible. But we're also talking about ending up with excess material in the concrete, but also on top of the concrete.
Yep.
That material is actually going to dehydrate. So pretty much every silicate will dehydrate, so the water will come out of it, it'll dry out. It will form a solid material in itself, but it's a different type of solid than what is created when the actual silicate reacts with the free lime and the concrete. So we're forming two solids. One is the solid that is a reaction with the Part A and the Part B, and we're trying to hit as much of that and create as much of that reaction as possible. And the second one is we're just leaving essentially a dehydrated solid in the
that's
structure of the concrete.
That's the Part A that dried out without the catalyst, the Part B.
Yep.
Right.
And we've all seen that dried Part A. It's never as hard as the stuff that's mixed with the Part B.
Yep.
Because Part B is not just a catalyst. Sometimes in some chemical families you actually need the Part B to help create the actual hardened end result. And sometimes the Part B just accelerates the reaction.
Yep.
So this is the Part B, the Part A that has dried out hard, but it's just still not as hard as the Part A, Part B reaction.
Yep. Okay. So then in this particular scenario, now we're talking about the importance of point of saturation, and what's happened here is I'm a contractor on site. I've just applied densifier to the surface, and now I'm listening to this podcast while I'm waiting for it to dry.
Yep.
Okay. And now I'm just going, oh, hang on, I've got to fill that to the point of saturation. I didn't, and it's nearly dry over there. So what's going to happen? Can I just go and pour more silicate on top of that? Because now I'm just putting effectively I'm putting Part A on top of Part A and B already almost dry. Is that a good illustration of what's happening here?
Yeah, look, I think there's probably a few different considerations. The first consideration is, you want to be doing it right from the first go.
Yep.
And doing right from the first go, from the onset, what does that look like? It looks like essentially keeping that concrete wet for a certain period of time. We know that the water component for densifiers is there to help carry it and help draw it into the concrete.
Yep.
So it helps with that the wetting up of the concrete and helps the being drawn into the concrete, a bit like what we do with the pre-hydration of the concrete before we spray down the polymer for the grouting. Draws it in through the capillaries. It creates that capillary action, or capillary action for our American listeners. So getting it wet to begin with, so it will draw the product into the concrete, is really important, and keeping it wet for a certain period of time so it can continue to draw in. I would say if it's going down and it's drying up very quickly, it's going to limit how much material can actually be absorbed into the concrete. It will affect the permeability or the absorption rate of subsequent applications. So it's really important to get it down heavy first and keep it wet for sort of 10 to 15 minutes, so you know that the concrete's getting the opportunity to really draw the product in.
Sure.
And that product has the opportunity to penetrate. If it's just flashing off on the surface, dry, it's kind of going to be sealing up the surface from a permeability point of view. So it won't be effective when you put subsequent applications of densifier on top of that. It will still wet up. It will still, particularly in the more porous areas, it will still have an effect. But I think the best result is always when that first application goes down and that concrete is looking and staying wet for sort of that 10 to 15 minute period on that first application.
Because it's actually getting access to the hydroxide, right? Because if you add silicate to silicate, then there's no reaction there, right?
No, not with the free lime.
Yeah,
some silicates will attach to themselves, obviously, but that's a different
scenario, different type of silicate.
Yep.
So then it's really important then that we have that point of saturation then purely just from getting the reaction where we actually want it to be.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we're putting densifier into the surface and it drops well down below the top of the substrate into the depth of the substrate, we want to polish what's at the surface level. So it's got to be completely filled up to the top,
mm-hmm.
and there needs to be hard calcium silicate, that hardened structure at the surface level. Because if there is not, effectively, we're not going to be contacting. Our tools are not going to be in contact with any material that is going to be the end product.
Yep. And that's a really important point, because that then comes. That brings up the subject of concentration of products, of silicates.
Yeah.
And we know from experience and research and just seeing the raft of different types of densifiers and silicates in the marketplace, there's a massive difference in solids content. And we're talking about products from sort of 12% up to 50%, all classified as densifiers, all being promoted as surface hardeners, all being promoted as used for polishing concrete applications. But their solids content is so different, and therefore their dilution is so different. So when we come back to what you're talking about, when you have a thin, low concentration product that you're essentially mainly putting water into the floor, when we go back to my comment a minute ago about keeping this floor wet for 10 to 15 minutes, I guess it probably has to come with the caveat that the product being used has to be a fairly high solids content product as well.
Yeah.
Because if you're putting down a product that's over 40% solids content into a floor and you're keeping it wet for 10 to 15 minutes, compared to a product that's 15% solid content, you're keeping it wet for 10 to 15 minutes, you're essentially satisfying what I've asked you to do or suggested you do.
There's plenty of water in this floor now.
It's looking wet. There's plenty of water, but you've got almost 2/3 less material that is going into that surface. And obviously, a higher water concentration is probably going to make a product penetrate a little bit deeper. But you're talking about spreading a much lower solids content of, call it active material, which is the silicate, through a deeper portion or to a greater depth of the concrete. So the concentration compared to it's essentially diluted into the surface of the concrete far deeper. So the possibility or the likelihood of it reacting with as much of the key ingredients, that part B, sort of in that, let's say that top 5 mil of the concrete, which is the important part for us from a polishing and end result point of view, is going to be greatly diminished compared to a product that's 40% plus solids sitting closer to the top, hanging around all the all the free lime that we actually want to be reacting with.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's a dilution, and it's like a double dilution. You've got a diluted product going a lot deeper into the concrete,
where it doesn't need to be going,
kind of being spread out over a whole lot of area and not doing a lot of good anywhere in comparison to keeping it near the surface and really targeting that surface top 5-6 millimeters of free lime and making sure that all of that is being converted as maximally as possible.
Yeah. Well, far out. Well, what are we, 10 minutes in now? I didn't know this is actually going to be such an exciting podcast. But far out, I'm this is riveting, all right? This is riveting. All right. That's the first question down.
I'm glad you're enjoying it, Josh.
Total geek out session here.
I guess what's important for us is always trying to relate that back to a practical implication. Okay, we can talk about from a theoretical point of view what's going on between materials and saturations and concentrations and distribution and all that kind of stuff. But for people installing this stuff, what are the most important things? We've already talked about we can't actually test how effective we are at this unless we're pulling up some of this concrete and throwing it into under electron microscopes and so forth, and looking at structures within the actual concrete and analysing how deep these reactions are going on, and what sort of density of this reacted silicate is forming in a crystalline way in the concrete. We can't do all that kind of stuff. We can, but that's not practical for guys, for installers of this sorts of product. So I guess from a technique and an application point of view, we teach certain ways of installing this stuff that are supposed to complement the theory or the technical sorts of geek out elements that we've just been talking about. So talk us a little bit about the let's call it the practical installation side of the product and how that complements the sorts of things that we're talking about.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So we talked about getting the densifier to sit where it's supposed to be. How much free lime is there in the concrete?
That's a very good question.
And what types of things affects how much free lime is in the concrete?
Huge.
That part B.
Yeah.
Are you telling me it's not the same? Because isn't it three shovels? 3, 2,
and 1.
Yeah. Which component was the free lime?
Yeah, well, it's a really good question, and we do get asked that a lot. Shouldn't we just be putting the same amount of volume into every bit of concrete? Isn't concrete? There is an assumption out there that concrete is they're all done to sort of regular standard sort of mixes, and that would apparently result in a fairly uniform outcome as far as cement, hydration reaction.
Oh, isn't that good news? Isn't that great news?
And therefore, we should be able to put the same amount of densifier in pretty much every time.
It makes me feel so much more secure on a job site.
Well, let's talk about what creates the free lime to begin with.
Yeah, let's do that.
Really, there's two elements. What creates this free lime, and how do you access it, or what affects how it can be accessed is probably a better way of putting it.
Let's do that.
So we know free lime, calcium hydroxide, is created by the hydration of cement. Okay, where does that happen?
Well, at the plant, it's going in the agitator and putting all the components together. Boom.
And we know that the way that every concrete plant wants to make the very best quality product for all of their customers, that every batch of concrete that goes out at an agitator from a plant is all A1 grade concrete, and it's all been made for a perfect.
It's all the best of the best.
It's made for the perfect laboratory outcome, and every concreter in this world knows exactly how to install that,
which is great
in the state that it's delivered. Correct. And every concrete spends the same amount of time in the agitator out on the road.
I'm sensing some sarcasm here.
So let's talk about some of the factors that were made from the very minute dot of when this stuff actually is created in the plant to actually when it's actually got not just installed on site, but essentially when our customers, contractors in this industry, rock up to actually start doing something with this piece of concrete. There's a whole raft of things that happen in between, from the moment it's mixed to the moment they wheel their machines out on the floor, that can affect how much free lime is in the concrete and how easy it is to access.
Okay. Well, I'm glad to keep coming back to this raft concept, because the more we talk about this, I'm not feeling like I'm only getting it. I still feel like I'm in the creek, but I still don't feel like I'm getting a paddle.
I thought you were going to get on the raft slab.
No, we better start getting some answers coming soon, because I'm starting to get anxious.
Well, obviously, okay. The basic one is how much cement's in the concrete.
Yep.
We know that generally speaking,
that's one shovel.
We know generally speaking, the higher the MPA, generally speaking, the more cement that's going to be in the mix. Okay?
Sure. That's how much water is in there? Okay, I'll leave that for later.
So, general rule of thumb is the higher the MPA rating is, at least from a mix design point of view, the more cement that should be in there. And therefore, essentially the more part B that should end up in the concrete because there's more particles. There's more particles that have encountered water, cement particles that is.
Sure.
And therefore there should be more calcium hydroxide that's formed in the concrete or free lime that's formed in the concrete. So from a presence of particles, the higher the MPa rating, the more free lime there should be.
Gotcha.
Okay? That's a really basic starting point. But we know that there's a lot of other ingredients that get put into the concrete as well. Some of them to actually reduce cement component. We know that there's a lot of technology research that's been done over the last sort of 15 or so years to reduce cement contents in concrete. But we also know that in different seasons, summer versus winter, there's different additives and so forth that affect how the concrete that are done to essentially adjust the concrete mixes for the actual natural environment that they're going into.
Yep.
Curing of the concrete, how long it's actually staying wet for, is another important element. So we know that a concrete that's put down in the summer, for instance, compared to a concrete that's put down in the winter, particularly here in the southern states of Australia where it's quite cold in the winter and we can put concrete down, that will stay green, that will retain moisture far longer than, say, a concrete that's put down in the winter in Queensland where it's warmer, it's drier, might be windier. So all the things that we talk about for curing and that affect the drying of the concrete, just the natural environment will also affect how long the moisture is retained in the concrete.
And then how does that affect our free lime content?
Well, the longer the moisture's in the concrete, the longer that this reaction with free lime with the cement particles will go on. I think there's an assumption that that people make is that when cement gets put into concrete, every single particle gets wet and gets mixed, and that's just not the case.
Really?
No, there is dormant, unreacted cement sitting in concrete. It's one of the reasons why the grouting system that we works so well, because we're actually reactivating or capitalising on some of the dormant cement in concrete when we grout the. It's not just the polymer that makes the product goes hard. It's actually some of the cement, so the dormant cement in the concrete as well.
Gotcha.
So the concrete mixing, batching, agitation process is really just a process of trying to maximise the hydration of the cement in the concrete, but doesn't necessarily always hydrate every particle of cement. So you can have same mixes, same mix designs, but you'll still get different amounts of free lime in the concrete because the cement in one mix hasn't been wetted as much as another one.
All right. So then how are you answering the question? How much free lime is there in the concrete?
Well, we've answered that question from the beginning. We don't actually know, and we don't actually know whether we're addressing every particle. We're just trying to maximise the process.
Okay, so then
and understanding what sort of elements or what sort of factors affect that process are important to understand.
So if a general rule of thumb then, and am I understanding this right? If we have a slab that's being installed, the slower that it can cure for, side-by-side comparison, slower that it can actually cure for, the better chance that we have for producing more free lime particles.
That's my understanding. If we had two slabs right next to each other, both at 20 MPa, both at whatever, exactly the same mix, let's say that the mix has been split in two, so we know it's the same batch.
Yep.
We could put them side by side, and one slab can stay wet or cure slowly over a lot longer period than the one next to it. We would end up with more free lime in the slower cured product.
Gotcha.
That is my understanding.
Cool. And how long does that process need to take? Over what period of time?
Well,
It's all right. I think we already covered that one with Peter Colleen.
did we?
Yeah, I think so.
Good. What was his answer?
I've got to try not to get too much into the substrate side of things because that's, we're talking about densifier, but it seems like the more that we ask questions about that, the more we've got to go down the rabbit hole and understand all the other related materials and processes around creating the outcome that we want to get. It seems like there's just so many pieces to take into consideration.
There is. And look, I guess the reason for these kinds of conversations is more an awareness of the variables that we're playing with and how from a technique and application point of view, we can maximise dealing with those variables to, let's say, manipulate it to the best possible outcome that we can get based on the time that we're actually coming into the equation as a part of this manufacturing process of this piece of concrete.
Sure. Okay. Well, I think the next question I've got for you is a whole lot easier to answer, I think. Many years ago, everybody was taking the floor up to grout, adding densifier, and calling it a day, calling it an overnight cure. A lot of people are not doing that anymore. Is it better to do an overnight cure of densifier or not?
My preference is still to have it sitting there for let's call it an extended period of time as opposed to an hour or two or something like that. It would probably just as much for the integrity of the grout as anything else, because let's remember we're putting densifier in at let's call it the most porous part of the concrete before it starts becoming unporous. If that makes any sense. Clearly, we could put densifier in after our first 30 grit cut or our 50 metal, where it's nice and porous and it'll suck up a lot of material and it's really easy to get it in, but we're going to be taking away a lot of that surface product that we were talking about before with the 50 metal or the grout step. So we're putting it down in the grout after grouting for a couple of reasons. One, because it's still very porous and it'll absorb a lot of material. And also because we've just completed the grouting step. So we've got all this filling that's been happening and we want that nice and treated and densified as possible too. Once we get past that point, we're obviously starting to polish the floor and make it smoother and what we call close it up. We're to a point where it starts receiving or not receiving densifier near as nice as it did when it was still in its porous state. So it's kind of the best place to be putting it in, from the ability to get it into the concrete, but also to affect how the integrity of our grout, we're hitting that at the same time. So I like the time element from leaving it sit just as much from it gives our grout the best chance to harden and also for the product to react in the grout and as much as anything else.
So we've got two different scenarios here. We've got an old concrete, it's probably swinging at about 22 MPa versus a new concrete, it's about 40 MPa. Is this advice, does it change at all for either of those two different scenarios?
How would you answer that question, Josh?
Well, my expectation is with the softer concrete, we've got to we need to get that a lot further. So if, say, for instance, our target is to have is to build a surface that's a whole lot more similar to, say, a 60 MPa or 100 MPa slab, right? And if we're starting down at 20, we've got a much longer road to travel, and we're going to get there with the densifier. Right? We're not bringing anything else to the equation, so we're going to do that with densifier. We've got a long way to go. If we're starting at 40 MPa, we've got a much shorter gap to bridge. Yeah,
and there's a few reasons for that that are coming to my mind, and one is obviously they're both got very different porosities. So it's in effect we talked about different solids content, right? And how a 15% solids content will get sucked into a concrete very differently to a 40 to 50% solids content material. Even though in this case we've got the same material, let's call it a 40% solid, 50% solids product going into the concrete, the porosity of the concrete is so different. It's almost like we're hitting it with different concentration densifiers, right? So we still get the same sort of effect of, like you're saying, in the harder spec concrete, our material is going to stay much closer to the surface because it's a more dense mix.
Yep.
Whereas with the softer, more porous mix, even a like-for-like material is going to go much deeper into it.
Mm.
So we're essentially, it's almost like treating concrete with a more dilute product.
Yep.
But it's not. It's just that the concrete's more porous and it's enabling that same spec, same solids content product to go deeper and further into it. And like you mentioned before, we're trying to keep that near the top. So yes, it takes more manipulation and more work to get it to that same endpoint or a similar endpoint as far as saturation as it would a 40 MPa concrete, where that material is held much closer to the surface, and therefore it's also going to be coming in contact. It's kind of a double whammy. It's being held closer to the surface because it's a more dense concrete.
Yep.
And because it's being held closer to the surface, it's sitting there in a more concentrated form. And the more concentrated form it is, the faster it's going to react with the free lime that's available in that surface of the concrete. Which
potentially there's more there anyway.
Correct. So it's a multiplication or a multiplying effect of all those different factors. So yes, I would agree with you that with the lower spec or the lower compressive strength concrete, it's a different process to get it to a similar endpoint.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's answered that question.
Right.
I think I know what I'm doing now. Almost. Almost. When I say almost, the next thing I'm going to be asking you is about lick coats. What is it that we're trying to achieve with a lick coat? Now, a lick coat is we've had the initial application of your deep and thick application of densifier. Initial ones down. We've talked about the reactivity of the A's and the B's.
Yep.
Birds and the bees. Sounds a bit like. Now we've just gone along. We've done a 50 resin. We've removed all that A that's not reacted with B.
Yep.
Right. And now we're creating a profile on the surface. The stage after this, or common practice after this, is to then do another application of densifier. What are we doing that for, and what's that achieving?
That's a good question, and I'm going to answer the densifier after that grouting step.
Yep.
And then you're going to answer the lick coat after preceding steps. Okay.
Why on earth would that be?
For fun.
Oh, okay.
Because we're geeking out, we're nerding out there, Josh.
Sure.
There's a few things. So we've talked about if we've done this properly, we've got it to a point of saturation or a point of rejection, as some people like to. But I struggle with rejection.
Yeah, sorry, it's triggering to you. You're getting that twitch in your neck again.
Yes, rejection goes back a long way for me. So I'm going to talk about saturation.
Yeah. Conversation was already deep enough.
It's hard enough. It's hard enough to have before you started talking about rejection. So the grout step, or following grout's an interesting time of this process for a number of different reasons. One, we're still working fairly aggressively. We're running a 50 metal or something similar to that, which is quite an aggressive product still, because we're trying to get rid of any metal bond scratches left on the floor. There's probably some residual grout smears and things like that are on the floor as well, which we're trying to eliminate. Et cetera, et cetera. So I guess one of the key things here is depending on how the grouting's been done, the grout binder or polymer can have an effect too, where it penetrates into the pores of the concrete at a superficial level. And depending on how it's done, depending on how much residual grout's left or grout smears and so forth, will affect and can impair how well the densifier actually penetrates into the concrete.
Sure.
So we can have parts of the floor, patches of the floor, areas of the floor where it's essentially been sealed. The pores have been sort of sealed, lined by the polymer, and has impeded the densifier going in to the concrete in certain areas. So we may not have a consistent penetration or impregnation of densifier all across the floor because of factors.
Some barriers.
Some barriers to do with the grouting process. So that would be my number one answer to that process. We've got it to the point of saturation. Why are we putting so much more densifier on it after we've done that sort of 50 resin step? Well, we've probably removed a lot of that. If there were barriers in the floor caused by the grouting process, we've removed them. We've actually exposed some more porous concrete where we can now get a second treatment of densifier into. And we're working to a much more consistent impregnation of densifier across the floor surface.
Sure.
So that'd be one of the key things that I would be suggesting we're doing densifier at that point.
Yeah, okay. After that, you've done 50s, you've removed any of the barriers caused by the grouting process. Now we've added another additional application of densifier. Then that sounds like the job's over. We've done 2, that's all we need. But now, after that's cured, we then proceed to doing 100s, and then another coat goes down. And that's the part that you were going to get me to answer.
Yes. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I'm in sales, Tim. I'm in sales. I just want to sell more product. You'll edit that out, won't you, Liam? That won't be in the podcast, right? Well, even when you do 200s, you're removing the excess off the surface. But then if you wipe your hand over the surface, you'll see that there's this dust on there. These are dust particles from actual concrete. And that, to me, says that we're still removing even just microns off the surface now. And we're exposing more particles that we haven't reacted with, which means that we have an additional opportunity to get that reaction and make a harder surface area again, because every time there's another opportunity to add some densifier to some unreacted lime, that's a bonus for us.
Well, and the other thing I think we're uncovering new avenues or channels in which the product can actually penetrate. And we're talking about much smaller percentages of effectiveness of the material compared to when we originally installed it at the grout level. But we can see how much less material from an actual consumption point of view we're applying at that point too. So we know that it's far less effective because we're actually putting a lot less material down at that point. But this now becomes a game of very small percentages, rather than the major steps that we're actually achieving.
Yeah, because if you did a side-by-side comparison, there'd be a difference. It's notable, but it's not massive.
Yeah,
we're looking for the 5s and 3s.
Yeah, and I think the other thing people need to understand is we're actually we're also moving into that stage where a fair bit of that material is more just dehydrated product that is being essentially formed in some of the microstructures of the concrete, which will contribute to our clarity and our finish and the tightness of the floor, but it's not necessarily all reacting with that part A, part B type scenario we're talking about at the beginning of the discussion.
So that means that stuff's not even there for the long haul.
Well, that all depends on the condition that floor is going to be subject to going forward.
Sure. Okay.
But it is not as stable from a chemical point of view as a silicate molecule that's actually reacted with the free lime.
Okay. Gotcha. All right. I got one more thing to ask. We've just talked about this whole process. We've talked about going from, our flood coat, the first application of the densifier, to the point of rejection or point of saturation. Sorry about that. I didn't mean to. That's a point of saturation, Tim. So we've gone a point of saturation.
Yep.
We've done our 50 resins. So we've gone another lit coat of densifier.
Yep.
200 grit resins, another lit coat.
Yep.
What about if we just went I've got this really great tool. Oh, I've got to show it to you. You're going to love this.
I
get to grout. We've done an overnight cure of densifier because I know how happy that makes you.
Mm-hmm.
And I've got this new tool. I pull it out of the box. It's a 1500 grit, and it's actually this is how good it is. This is like that one tool does everything. I put this on after my metals, my GRTs, the densifier, and I polish with my 1500s, and I actually get like a 90 points of gloss in one pass with these 1500 grits.
Mm-hmm.
Is the floor going to be as good?
It's going to be a theoretical answer because we haven't actually developed that tool yet, Josh. Or if you've got it, I'm really looking forward to seeing it.
Just step into my imaginary world for a second. Yeah.
Look, I guess my theoretical answer is going to be it's not as good, and I think we've already covered some of the reasons for that.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about removing microns before. We talk about the next step in a polishing process is always putting a finer scratch that is established deeper than the previous scratch, if that makes sense.
Yep.
That means that the previous scratches are all removed and they've been replaced by a finer scratch or a finer corrugation, because that's really what we're achieving, a corrugated surface, but they just become smaller and smaller and smaller corrugations. So if we could take a 1500 tool that would happily work after that grouting process,
it's very happy to work,
and we'd all be very happy, except for those customers that people that want these satin matte finished floors. It'd take a bit longer for us to develop that tool. Probably for some of the things we've been talking about, particularly at the grouting stage, if we're going to be removing all that excess grout, that excess densifier, the scratches in the floor, we're going to be establishing a new layer that's below some of those grout smears and so forth, that polymer that's inhibited the initial absorption of the densifier. So my gut feel and my theoretical reasoning is going to be no, it's not going to be as good because we haven't had the opportunity to get as much densifier into the floor, particularly in those first, at 50, 100 and 200 in those stages where we're still managing to get the most amount of product into the floor. And we know that because we're using most of the time we're using a potassium-based product for that, which is a heavier, thicker material.
Mm-hmm.
We know that later on people are doing lit coats with lithium-based silicates, which are a smaller molecule and penetrate easier. So we know the floor is going to take less material because we need something more highly penetrative to get in. So the fact that we're skipping out those steps after 50, after 100, in particular, where we're still putting a lot of densifier down, we're not going to end up with the same end result. That's my gut feel.
And that's why you don't have that tool.
That's exactly right.
I'm assuming if we had that tool, you'd also be able to tell me the biggest question in my life is: does a unicorn prefer a sugar lump or a sugar cube? We don't have 1500 yet. It goes from our grout stage to 1500, so we won't be able to answer the question.
Are there any other factors you can think of in that hypothetical scenario, Josh?
Not really. Really, it's really just the substrate building that we're talking about with the additional applications of densifier and getting as much material into there.
Yeah.
Into the
probably the other thing that I'm just thinking about now too is we're talking about a chemical reaction. That's the reaction that we're after is the actual chemical reaction. And every chemical reaction is accelerated by temperature. Mm-hmm. That is a known fact. Pretty much with every chemical action that is done, whether it be concrete gets warm when it's going off. It needs temperature, or it creates temperature. Temperature catalyzes or speeds up a reaction. A lot of these lit coats and densifier steps we're talking about, we're running a resin tool through it. We're generating a lot of temperature in the floor, so we are not only pushing material into the concrete as best as we can, but we're applying a lot of temperature that's going to catalyze or speed up or make that reaction happen faster and better than it would on its own accord. Just like you said before, there's part A that dries off. it never gets as good as when it's reacted with part B, sometimes from a chemical reaction point of view, but sometimes just because it never gets to the right temperature.
Sure.
Okay. So by running resins through densifier, sometimes moist densifier, we're putting a lot of temperature into that floor. It's only surface bound or limited to the surface, but that is also catalyzing or speeding up the reaction of these silicates in the concrete.
Sure.
I mean, the reaction may take 3 weeks, right? But we're already the reaction that suits the tools the best, if it was just left to its own devices, might take 3 weeks to do what it needs to do under normal ambient temperature conditions. But the fact that we're putting a lot of temperature into the concrete through the actual tools running over the floor is going to speed up that reaction. And again,
I just want to clarify, is this reaction or curing?
This is reaction. This is a chemical reaction of the actual silicate,
Yep.
not the curing of the concrete.
No, curing of the reaction.
Okay. So, there's probably an element of both to that. Yes.
Yep.
And I think we know that because we talked about how long do you leave it for before.
Yep.
Okay. When we get onto it early, within hours of densifying, we change our technique a little bit because we're missing out on part of the benefits of leaving it long.
Sure.
But we are capitalising on our ability to increase temperature to it early.
Yep.
So we're curing that reaction of the application of the silicate
Accelerating
into
the
the
curing.
concrete. We're accelerating it.
Yep.
So the temperature from the dry process and that from those resins, definitely is. Once again, how much is it improving? We don't really know. But we know it's making a difference because we know from a chemistry and physical properties point of view and what sort of elements affect reactions, affect curing of products, these types of products. Temperature is a good thing, generally speaking. So the more of this whole process we're talking about is really stacking about as many things in our favour as we can without knowing exact measurables, because we're not pulling concrete out of not taking core samples at every step along the way and sticking under electron microscopes and seeing how it actually has changed from step to step. We just know from a properties point of view and the nature of these types of materials and how they work together, that the more of these sorts of things that we do, the more that we're just enhancing or stacking the odds in our favours to get the best result out of the combination of these products and the materials together.
Yep. Wow.
That's probably how I would sum it up.
Yep. Okay. Well, I'm glad there's not much involved in this. Tim, the level of knowledge that you have on this makes me think you need to get out more. Yeah. There's depth of understanding. Actually, I'm not impressed. I'm worried. I think you need to get out more.
Makes me think I need to get into something else.
You need a hobby, Tim. Seriously. Thank you very much for joining us today and taking this deep dive into this pivotal part of a process in our industry that I think a lot of us take for granted. It's really an eye-opener to see how many moving parts that there are that to take into consideration. You have a significant wealth of knowledge in this area, and thank you for sharing with us today.
You're welcome, Josh. It's fun. It's good talking about it. And I guess, look, relating it back to that conversation that we have about our contractors being mobile manufacturing plants, whilst this is not the sort of thing that we're thinking about every day, it's just good to know. Remember, most of this stuff with other materials is done in the factory before an installer gets their hands on it, right? So most of these sorts of things, installers of carpet and vinyl and epoxies and so forth don't really need to know about because that's taken care of prior to the material coming to their hand. This is just an essential part of being a manufacturer, which all of our customers are that are doing this kind of work. So it's good to know. It's good to know. It's going to result in practices that make it all easy, but it's just good to know some of the underlying.
Absolutely. Yeah. Keep us more equipped, more skilled.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's kind of thing that keeps us interested in what we're doing.
I'd still recommend a hobby. Thanks again, Tim.
Thanks, Josh.
This show is proudly supported by Works Plus. Works Plus brings total solutions to all concrete grinding and polishing contractors to make it totally work for their daily operations. We hope you've enjoyed this show. Make sure to tune in each week where we're going to dive deep into all things related to concrete grinding and polishing. We're here to help you so that you can boost your outcomes on the floor.